Thank you so much, and I really appreciate the previous speakers giving us this context about the restriction on democracy, and I would say also the restriction on our freedom as citizens, as legislators, as elected officials, as workers, as consumers, which is why in my office we're an Office of Economists. We actually refer to these agreements as corporate trade agreements because we find nothing free about negotiations held behind closed doors at the behest of transnational corporations to actually restrict the decision-making space of the general public. And I want to talk a little bit today about how we got to the place that we are. Historically, we had a mix, obviously, of public and private services, but services were something that were considered domestic. They were produced and consumed on the domestic level, and a country regulated their services or provided services according to its economic ability, the goals of its citizens, and a mix of various different social goals. And it seems like now we're headed towards a different vision, a different model of how services are regulated, produced, and consumed, towards one that is a set of binding treaties that combine liberalization, privatization, and deregulation, and market-oriented regulation. So how did this happen? And I'm going to go through a little bit the history of how corporations, primarily based in the United States, which is where I am from, invented the idea of trade and services and actually got through the international trade regime a set of binding agreements to lock in that privatization, deregulation, and liberalization under the guise of trade and services. So how did this start? In the 1970s and 80s, we saw developed countries sort of losing their comparative advantage in manufacturing and looking for ways that they could expand their market access to other countries and to be able to turn, as was mentioned, services into more profit-making centers. And we see then that the rules that govern trade and services now are not really about actual trade that happens in many cases, but is really about enforcing a set of rules designed by corporations within national countries as well as across international boundaries, to set a set of rules where the domestic regulations of countries and the domestic provision of services are seen as barriers to the expansion of corporate profit. And certainly from the point of view of our world is not for sale and our many allies around the world, we believe that this trend should be reversed, that it is not inevitable, and that affordable quality public services and proper democratic oversight of public and private services must be ensured around the world. So how did this happen? You know, we used to think of manufacturing as sort of the biggest aspect of the economy, and certainly it has been for a long time. But with the vertical integration of corporations around the world with globalization, we saw that many aspects of what used to be called manufacturing now are actually called services. So employment contracting, transportation, shipping, warehousing, marketing, retail distribution, just to name a few, logistics, these used to be considered part of manufacturing a product and distributing it around the world and are now captured as services. Obviously, the liberalization of public services created more market share for the corporate lobbies and enabled them to capture a larger portion of the international services markets and domestic services markets. But because historically services were not traded but were provided socially, they were not tracked as part of the economy as much as exports as manufactured goods. So this is something we see in the statistics, that now we see this big explosion of what's called trade and services. So somewhat that's true. Obviously services are a bigger part of our economy than they used to be, but it's partially an accounting issue that they just didn't used to be tracked in the same way. And that's important because the bigger the share of the economy that trade and services are, the bigger argument it gives to the corporations involved in their production and trade that they have to say, well, we have to have a trade agreement about this issue now. And just to state how big the claim is on the economy, TISA proponents claim that the services sector is the world's largest employer and accounts for nearly half of the 3.3 billion people working in services industries and 70% of global GDP. So it's certainly a big sector that we're talking about. So how did this come to happen? Corporations actually did invent the concept of trade and services. They started by creating within the United States a legal basis. In 1974, the U.S. Trade Act mandated our executive for the first time to negotiate the removal of barriers to international trade in goods and services. That was the first time it was added. And establish industry advisory committee that was overseen by big corporations in the financial services sector. They then created a narrative about the need to address barriers in trade in services. And the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, led by these global financial and insurance industries, published a report about barriers faced by U.S. services corporations. And they established an international services industry committee that was chaired by corporations, obviously, in the years subsequent to that. They also realized that in order to use the narrative of trade to actually liberalize and deregulate services, that they were going to have to marginalize the international agencies that already existed for the international regulation globally of some of these industries, like telecoms and airplanes, that already existed, because those regulators were not interested in the deregulatory agenda of the corporations, but rather it could be done through the vehicle of trade agreements. Throughout then the years, in the 1980s, they worked to build consensus with other governments. The USTR developed with other developed countries the concept of a need to develop a trade and services agreement through the OECD. They created an industry association in the United States, the U.S. Coalition of Services Industries, chaired again by the financial services sector, the same financial services sector that brought us the greatest recession in the last 80 years. Yes, they were the ones who invented this concept. They unfortunately had a favorable political context at that time. I think that's important to point out because it's not the case now. We've seen so many years of problems with this type of deregulation that is a very different political context, and that's why it's important to actually think about making sure that this agreement doesn't come into existence. And what did they do? They made informational demands at first to say, well, let's just do assessments and reports about barriers to trade and services. And I point this out because this is a tactic that's often used in international negotiations on the issue of transparency. Well, let's just have transparency in this issue, publish reports, look at barriers, and it's a stepping stone, obviously, to eventually say, well, there's too many barriers to trade in this issue, and we need to have a deregulatory so-called free trade agreement. And the conclusion of that was to negotiate a stepping stone compromise. Big push by the U.S., some hesitation by the EU, lots of developing countries opposed to it, led by India and Brazil, that there was, as we well know, the Ministerial Declaration of 1986 launching the Uruguay round that did include the agenda of services of the corporations being brought into the global trade regime, but it included the mandate in the context of respect for policy objectives of national laws and regulations. So you can see the balance there. In terms of the Uruguay round, we know obviously that the General Agreement on Trade and Services was hatched. There was a lot more corporate lobbying that happened at this time in order to ensure that this agreement came to the fore in the best interest of the corporations. I'm quite sure that the vast majority of the public did not know that there was a General Agreement on Trade and Services being negotiated at the time. Far less knowledge by trade unions, by consumers, by elected officials, by democratic representatives. And then they mobilized third-party allies. So we saw at that time influential think tanks reverberating the message of the corporate agenda at that time. And then they made a lot of proposals for different ways that the agreement could be structured, therefore sort of defining the field of what the debate was. And that's a very important aspect to think about, because it's also why we need to have our proposals. And when I've talked to USTR before about, well, of course we're negotiating this because it's what our services corporations want. And I say, well, what about all the other people who might not want one? And they say, what do you mean? I said, well, the consumers, the elected officials, the workers, the people who want clean drinking water, the people who want local regulation, the state and local elected officials. And they sort of look like, oh, I hadn't thought about them. They maybe, well, what do they want? What's their proposal? To not have a trade and services agreement is their proposal. Obviously, at the end of the talks, there was a consensus emerged from the negotiations, as we well know, to have general principles apply across the board, but only to have a so-called positive list in the scheduling where the only sectors that are subject to the rules are those that a country specifically agrees to schedule. And that, as we know, GATS entered into force in 1995. This is a quote: without the enormous pressure generated by the American financial services sector, particularly companies like American Express and Citicorp, there would have been no services agreement, and therefore perhaps no Uruguay round and no WTO. That is from one of the lead officials responsible for the GATS. That is not a anti-trade critique. That is from the negotiators. Okay, so we need to understand this definitely as a corporate project, as a way that transnational corporations that have an interest in the marketing and production and distribution and capturing of this sector from the public have invented these proposals. They did not achieve all of their agenda, however. They got a lot with the GATS, but there's still a lot that that was held back, obviously, that they are still trying to get through this current agreement. They did, however, get a built-in obligation to expand. And so part of the GATS text, as we know, is a commitment to progressive liberalization, to have another round of expansion of offers and requests and more services being bound into global trade rules, and we know that as the GATS 2000. They also had built-in obligation commitment to negotiate on domestic regulation. We know that at the time of the launching of this current round, the Doha round of the WTO that we're in, that by and large, developing countries were generally opposed to there being a new round. They didn't want another round of liberalization, of deregulation, of the type of agreement that came out of Uruguay, but rather they put forward more than 100 proposals that are called the implementation agenda that were actually to fix existing asymmetries in the negotiations as they had emerged from Uruguay due to the asymmetry of power, obviously, in the negotiations. But we also know that services are one of the primary opposing just the offensive agenda of the global north, of the services corporations based primarily in developed countries. And so that is important to think of when we think about the way that the negotiations have gone now. Post 9/11, Doha was launched, we know, and GATS was folded into the single undertaking. For those who just may not be familiar, the basic framework obviously borrowed from the GATT, again using the trade, what existed in global trade rules applied to services. That is a completely different sector, but the idea that states must treat foreign corporations no less advantageously as national companies. And so that is referred to as non-discrimination. It's the basic principle of national treatment, but it means that even if foreign companies have many advantages, such as that of scale, they might be much bigger, they might have more advanced technology, they may have decades of state support behind them, once entering into the agreement, you have to, as a country, treat that foreign corporation just the same as you would a domestic corporation, or more favorably, but not less favorably. The other basic concept is we know that the state must treat companies of all foreign countries the same as what they treat that from the best treatment that they give to a country, again referred to as non-discrimination, and that is, as we know, our basic MFN concept. Now, in the GATS, as we know, we have 4 modes of delivery. I think this is one of the most interesting aspects for people who might not be as familiar with it. I know many of you, we have people here from over 40 missions based in Geneva, so many of you are very familiar with this, but we also have people from around the world who might not be as much. Only one of the modes really deals with trade and services. Okay, so that's mode 1 of the GATS, called cross-border supply. Mode 2 is when a consumer moves to consume a service abroad, called consumption abroad. Number 3, in English, we actually refer to this as investment, but in the GATS, it's called commercial presence, when a corporation moves to provide a service in a foreign country. And number 4, in English, we refer to as immigration, but in GATS, it's called the presence of natural persons, or mode 4, when a worker moves. And as we can see, only one really has that much to do with trade. In terms of committing schedules, I've mentioned before, GATS is a positive list. It's bottom up, so countries schedule which services they want to commit, and then limitations that they'll take on national treatment or market access and exemptions to MFN. And we know that the free trade agreements, so-called free trade agreements with the United States, are done on a negative list basis, so the other way around. These is the basic list of the service sectors included. For many of you might be familiar. This is the dozen or so main headlines. And within any of these, like business services, there's a whole range of services that you might not know are actually included in the GATS, and each country's schedule is going to have the listing of what they commit under that sector, and then any exemptions and exclusions they might have. And just to let you know, for each one of these, there is a whole big long schedule. So just for example, you can't even read this, it's so much text, but this is just one of the sectors, financial, and these are all of the different ways that financial services can be scheduled in the GATS. There are binding irreversible liberalization rules. We know that WTO came with a dispute settlement mechanism. Very difficult once you commit it to reverse that liberalization. And we know that that's really important because there's so many countries, municipalities, cities, states that have had failed experiments with privatization and are trying to remunicipalize or renationalize. And we're going to hear from a speaker later on today about the specific case of Bolivia, when it passed a new constitution that gave its citizens the right to health care, and they therefore had to rescind their commitment on hospital services in the WTO. This happened, I think, about 5 years ago, and the United States is still blocking them from doing that, demanding that they give compensation market access in another sector if they're going to rescind a sector. And it's interesting to me to compare this with other negotiations and issues that we care about, like labor, human rights, and health, because when we work on things like corporate accountability or labor issues, corporations always say, well, we can't have a binding agreement, let's have a corporate code of conduct, let's have a voluntary agreement on environmental guidelines, let's have a voluntary standards for labor rights. But when it comes to trade, it absolutely has to be written in stone with a dispute settlement mechanism and the inability to take it out. I want to wrap up here. We know, obviously, that the Doha round is not really going very fast. There has been changes in the political climate. I think people have started to see some of the problems of the impacts of the GATS on their country, the chill on regulation, the difficulty with getting sectors back out of the commitments. There has been a lot of resistance that's developed, and particularly we know during the GATS 2000 round there was a lot of mobilization by European activists, for example, when they found out that their country was demanding that drinking water be included in the new round. And there obviously have been geopolitical changes that have happened since the round was launched, including obviously the fact that there are emerging market countries and developing countries who are not interested in having the U.S. corporate agenda necessarily be setting the agenda for the entire world. And we've had a global crisis emerge where we've seen the results of financial deregulation, the problems that have happened, the impact on jobs inequality, and the results of what this sector in particular, the U.S. financial sector, that led and created the introduction of GATS into the global trading system, the meltdown that's happened because of that. Because of this breakdown, we see the U.S. corporate agenda going in sort of this two-pronged approach. On one side with the mega regionals that Herta talked about with TTIP and CETA, and in the U.S. the TPP, and on the other side looking at plurilaterals in their main offensive agenda, both of services and goods negotiations. And last then we see them launching the TISA in late 2012 with the really good Friends of Services pushed by the major industries. So in conclusion, I would just say that business and the transnational corporations had a vision of being able to use the vehicle of trade to implement a very broad deregulation and liberalization agenda in services around the world, and they came up using the idea of trade to make those permanent. They did not get as much liberalization and deregulation as they wanted in GATS, and they're still pushing it through this two-pronged approach. But we certainly believe that locking in further deregulation and privatization is not inevitable. It doesn't have to happen, and that consumers and citizens and workers and regulators and elected officials at all levels, certainly for the most part, many of us believe that quality, accessible public services and democratic oversight of public and private services should prevail. Thank you very much.